right, well, welcome everyone. It's December, we have made it. I know many of you are looking forward to a break coming up soon. And so I'm sure that that means this week has been really crazy for you. So thank you so much for taking some time out to join us today. We hope you can just take a breath and sit and listen and take in some of this great knowledge that you're going to get today. So I do want to introduce our speaker. We're really excited about her today. So Sydney Jensen is a Georgia native and also a 9th grade English teacher at Lincoln High School in the epicenter of America's heartland, Lincoln, Nebraska. Lincoln is one of the nation's top cities for refugee resettlement, and students at Lincoln High speak more than 30 languages. Jensen also serves as an instructional coordinator, working with new and veteran teachers to provide instructional support and mentorship, and is an adjunct professor at Doane University, where she teaches a course on being trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. In recognition of her work in the classroom and the school community, Jensen is the 2019 Nebraska Teacher of the Year. She is a passionate advocate for increased mental and emotional wellness support for both students and the teachers who serve them. While she is not teaching, she is advocating to policy leaders about the importance of supporting teacher wellness. In 2019, she gave an official TED Talk on the impact of secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue on teachers who work with students experiencing trauma. Her talk has received over 2.6 million views to date. And this is where we intersected with Sydney. We saw her TED Talk and we were so excited about her compassion and her excitement about talking about wellness for teachers. And we really wanted to bring that topic to our PLC, especially here in December, as we know that you all have been working so hard for your students all year. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sydney.
Hi, good morning. Thank y'all so much for joining me. I am so excited to come together and learn with all of y'all and do what I hope will be some really impactful and helpful reflection, where you'll walk away from this session with some actionable strategies and a plan for improving upon your own wellness. And so I'm really excited for our time together today. And thank you so much, Janice, for that introduction. My name is Sydney Jensen. I'm going to open with a little story about myself, just so we can get better acquainted. And what I would like for you to do is take a second and go ahead and type into the chat where you're from and who you serve. Are you a classroom teacher? What grade do you work with? Are you an administrator? I would love to hear more about the people in the room. So my name is Sydney Jensen. I did not grow up in Lincoln, Nebraska. I am a transplant here. I actually grew up in Eatonton, Georgia. It's pretty much right in the middle of the state. From there, I went to the University of Georgia and majored in English education. It was during my time in college that I just decided I wanted to be a summer camp counselor. I'd never had the opportunity to attend camp as a kid, and it always looked really cool in movies like the Parent Trap and things like that. And so I applied to work for a YMCA camp that just so happened to be right here in Nebraska. I fulfilled my mother's nightmare, as she would call it, and happened to meet someone and fall in love at camp. And so I moved to Nebraska after we got married in 2014 and have been teaching in Lincoln Public Schools ever since. And so this is my 9th year teaching. I'm still in that early to mid-career range, which is exciting. And I also am an adjunct professor at Doane University, which is where I got my master's degree in educational leadership in 2020. This picture I like to start with because it's a fun story. Peach stands are really popular in Georgia, as you would imagine it being the peach state. And this peach stand is right up the road from my parents' house, about a mile away. It's a great landmark because it's there on the highway, and people always know it because if you look closely right here on the side of it, the word peaches is actually spelled wrong. And so people lovingly refer to it as the Petch Stand. It's also prominently featured in the opening credits of the 1992 hit movie My Cousin Vinny. So that is our secondary claim to fame that down there in Eatonton, Georgia. But I actually didn't go to the University of Georgia originally to be a teacher. I thought I was going to be a pharmacist, which when you try and have me do quick math is a little bit comical in hindsight. And I really figured out that I wanted to be a teacher when I came to work at YMCA Camp Kitaki. At camp, there is this wonderful pond right in the center of main camp. All of the kids walk past it on the way to and from most of their activities throughout the day. And one evening, I was counseling a group of 10-year-old girls. There were about 15 of them, and we were on our way back from the shower house, and we saw this mama turtle digging a hole to lay her eggs in, and we thought it was the coolest thing we'd ever seen. I don't know anything about turtles, but we went down to the Nature Lodge and found a book that had a little reference section on turtles, and we read all about it. And any other cabin group that walked by, we excitedly stopped them to tell them about this like magical moment of nature that we were all bearing witness to. And we became little amateur turtle enthusiasts. We ended up grabbing our sleeping bags and sleeping out that night so that we could watch this mama turtle do her work. And it was after that week at camp that I thought to myself, man, it's really fun to learn with kids. I think I want to be a teacher. And so I came back to Athens, Georgia. I talked to my advisor. I changed my major to English education because English and writing is something that I always felt like I was pretty good at. And I really found what I think is my place as an English teacher. And the cool thing about working at a summer camp and the cool thing about teaching is that you have this amazing opportunity to make a really big impact in the lives of so many young people. The downside is that we often don't know the impact that we're making until way down the line, and that can be really hard. Something cool that happened a couple of years ago is that the camp director at Camp Kitaki filmed a quick video of a mama turtle doing exactly that thing of digging a hole to lay her eggs in. And he posted it on the camp Facebook page. And there was a comment from one of my campers from way back when. She wrote, "It must have been the 2010 era. I remember how fascinating my cabin mates and I thought that mama turtle and her babies were. Lots of hours spent watching. Glad to see the next generation continuing the tradition." And I saw that and I thought, wow, that is such a great metaphor for what it's like to be a teacher, that often it is years and years later when we hear about what a big difference we made for our students. And that is really like the nectar, the marrow of teaching and why it's such an incredible profession that we all get to be a part of. And so now I teach at Lincoln High, as Janice mentioned. Lincoln High has about 2,400 students. Lincoln, Nebraska, something I didn't know before moving here, is one of the top 5 cities for refugee resettlement in the country. Anytime there is civil unrest around the world, we tend to see an influx of families from that area. And so we have over 30 home languages spoken by the students in our building, which is really incredible. One of the things that comes with that is that we have many students who have experienced pretty severe trauma. We have students who've spent months, if not years, in refugee camps, students who have witnessed terrible acts of violence towards their community members or sometimes even their family members. And so something that I've learned in my time at Lincoln High is that many of our students are carrying the weight of trauma that is unimaginable for me as someone who grew up in Eatonton, Georgia. And that to me is the really hard part of teaching. We often hear about things like meetings that could have been emails, grades that are piling up, lesson planning, challenging parents, that sort of thing. But the real struggle with teaching is that often it feels like we can never do enough to help our students. And that is a really heavy burden to bear. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, are those elements of trauma, how that impacts us as teachers, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the civil unrest that we have witnessed over the past couple of years right here in the USA. And we're going to hopefully come up with an action plan for ourselves to move forward intentionally in the interest of our own wellness. And so we have a few ground rules here. The first one is what is shared here stays here. The second is what's learned here leaves here. So feel free to post in the chat as much as you're comfortable, but make sure that we keep that as a group who's sharing this time and space together. But if you see something that you think will be helpful to your colleagues, please feel free to take that learning back to them and share it. And this one comes from summer camp. We do a lot of taking kids down to a ropes course, asking them to climb to new heights and take leaps of faith. And the rule that we have at Camp Kitaki is that everything is your challenge, your choice. And that is true here today as well. So do what you are comfortable with, share what you're comfortable with, and I'm excited to learn together. So we'll start with just a baseline of what is trauma. And there are a couple of differences in different types of trauma. First of all, trauma is in the eye of the person who's experienced it. And there are examples of trauma that may not feel traumatic to me, but to the person experiencing them, that is trauma. And so we want to focus not necessarily on the story of the trauma, but the impact of it. How does that change the behavior of our students, the behavior of ourselves? And so we can categorize it as single incident trauma, that's that acute trauma, an event, an accident, an assault, and complex trauma, experiencing ongoing things like war, abuse, poverty, developmental trauma, and neglect. And I would argue that COVID-19 has moved from single incident into complex trauma, especially as we are faced with yet another variant and an extended amount of time that we are having to pivot and shift as a result of the virus. And so when we think about primary trauma for ourselves and our students, one of the main things with that is the ACEs test. I'm going to drop a link into our chat. And you can also scan that QR code. This link takes you to the actual ACEs quiz. It's very short. It's just a few questions, and they're largely just true or false, yes or no. The ACEs quiz measures adverse childhood experiences. And so it categorizes it in these different ways: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction, growing up in a household with someone who is struggling with mental illness, domestic violence, divorce, substance abuse, and incarcerated relatives. And what we know about ACEs is that those can be pretty impactful on a child as they become an adult. There are certain statistics that are linked back to having a high ACEs score. And as teachers, when we learn about the struggles of the students in our care, that can lead to secondary or vicarious trauma. The research that has been done on this is pretty interesting. There's been some extensive research done on counselors who worked with survivors of 9/11. These counselors weren't in the Twin Towers. They maybe weren't even in New York City on the day of the attacks, but hearing the stories of their patients over time has caused similar responses and trauma triggers to those who were actually present on that day. And the same thing is true for teachers. When we hear the stories of our students' trauma, that can have a pretty profound effect on us. And we see the same anatomical response to trauma in teachers who are experiencing secondary traumatic stress as those who are experiencing primary traumatic stress. There's also transgenerational trauma, cultural trauma, race-based trauma, and all of these we have to keep in mind as we work with students who are coming back to school in the midst of a pandemic. If you go to the CDC's website, it gives a really nice overview of the correlation between high ACEs scores and how toxic stress from ACEs can change brain development and affect everything from attention, decision-making, learning, response to stress, all the way up through adulthood with unstable work histories, struggling with finances, jobs, and depression throughout life. So I want us to think about our own experiences with the students in our classrooms. And so if you'll take a moment to find on your Zoom toolbar your thumbs up reaction, I'm going to present you with a few different examples. And if you'll give your thumbs up to indicate whether or not you've experienced these behaviors in your classroom. So give me a thumbs up if you've experienced a student refusing to answer a question or read aloud. Seeing lots of thumbs. A student trying to change the subject when getting in trouble. A student putting their head down after a redirect. A student throwing something in frustration. A student raising their voice. A student storming out of class. And a student trying to justify their actions by deflecting to another student. Thank you for participating in that. So all of those reactions really fall under that anatomical response to trauma of fight, flight, and freeze. When we see students, especially our younger students, literally hide in their sweatshirt, that is a form of flight. They're escaping the situation. Putting your head down in response to a redirect, that's an escape. Storming out of the classroom, shouting back at the teacher, those are examples of fight and flight. And what's happening there is we're seeing students struggle with staying in what we call their learning brain versus their survival brain. When we're in survival brain, we're like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. We are focused on taking that next step and just trying to survive. We really struggle with living in a gray area, and we're not in a good space to take healthy risks that lead to learning. But when we're in our learning brain, that's like, I've heard the metaphor of like baby elephants who are surrounded by protective mama elephants. They don't have to worry about what might be coming up over the hill because they know that they have caring adults around them who are looking out for them. And as a result, they can be a little bit more carefree. They can live within that gray area and they can take those healthy risks that lead to learning. And the thing is, that same thing is true for teachers. In a conversation with a grad student in my master's level class at Doane, they said, in the past year, I heard many teachers say that they were in survival mode. I know that I even said it a few times. It was a tough year for everyone, teachers and students. And I wonder how many teachers and students were camping out in our survival brains for the year. When all of society is in a pandemic, is there a safe place? How many of us were in our fight, flight, or freeze response all year long? And that's the thing, is that survival brain is always going to trump learning brain. So now I want you, yes, tough for administrators too. Thank you for pointing that out, Kelly. So now I want you to use that same thumbs up response reaction to indicate whether you've experienced some of these feelings. Being overwhelmed by the day-to-day work of teaching. Feeling unappreciated by your direct supervisor, whether that's administrative staff, district officials, or the community. Feeling misunderstood by those who are outside of education. Feeling frustrated by a lack of adequate resources. Guilt when you think about the opportunity gap for your students in poverty. Fear of violent acts aimed at schools. Feeling lonely at school. And finally, feeling like your family or friends don't understand what you experience as a teacher. Thank you for your vulnerability in those reactions. So we were already feeling many of those things before the pandemic, and then the pandemic swooped in and really exacerbated some of those. We know that so much of our wellness is in being able to connect with other people. And with the pandemic, we had to shoulder the responsibility for our communities to make sure that we were social distancing, wearing masks. We went from having those opportunities to connect with colleagues in the staff lounge during lunch and shared plan periods, and maybe going out on Friday afternoons as a department or as a group with some of our work friends and colleagues, to eating lunch alone rather than risk passing along the virus to someone else, going straight home, restaurants being shut down. And so those weren't even an option to be able to go and enjoy that time together. And so it became a lot more isolating in a field that can already be a little bit isolating as teachers. We're used to shutting our doors and teaching sort of in secrecy. I know in my first few years as a teacher, I really struggled with feeling like, man, everybody else has it figured out, and I have to close my door and like talk a little quietly so that no one hears that I'm struggling in here. And that's a real challenge. And that has only been multiplied in the pandemic. And then last year, hard work got even harder. We saw cancellations, school shutdowns. We had to learn how to teach remotely in many areas of the United States. We saw the virus spreading across the country and felt probably some fear and anxiety about that and what that would mean for us. And then we saw a little bit of a shift. Teachers went from being the heroes of the pandemic to, in some ways, being vilified. And then this year, how will we counteract learning loss? What will we do to catch students up who have missed that in-person learning? And so that has led to teachers suffering from multiple layers of trauma. The way the virus, stress of the election, and civil unrest has impacted each of us directly, and that pressure to mitigate learning loss is primary trauma. And then we have that secondary or vicarious trauma, what we catch from our students and from others as we see how they're affected as a result of the events of 2020 and now 2021. And that's a cycle. Research has shown that 86% of teachers across early childhood settings experienced some depressive symptoms during the prior week. 62% of high poverty schools report that it's challenging to retain high quality teachers. And we are now looking towards that staffing crisis as we are in the midst of this great resignation. Teachers are class covering more than I think historically they ever have. We're experiencing sub shortages. One of my colleagues said to me, yesterday was a 3-cry day: plan period, lunch, and after school. And I think this is something that we're seeing more and more of as we try and find balance. And that has to be the goal, because we as teachers are not immune to the effect of trauma. Our resilience as a community of educators is vital if we're going to make a way forward that's more equitable, intentional, and sustainable for our students and for ourselves. And so that's what I want to focus on with the rest of this session: is how do we set healthy boundaries and healthy commitments to ourselves and to our school communities, because teachers are so at risk for secondary traumatic stress. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network found that risk appears to be greater among educators with previous or unresolved trauma exposure, female educators, educators who are highly empathetic, new or inexperienced educators with a lack of training, educators working with unsupportive administrators, educators working in communities that have experienced communal trauma, including high levels of poverty, crime, generational or historical trauma, tragic events, and national disasters. And I would say, in light of COVID, that last bullet point is really blanketing all of us, no matter where we teach or who we serve. And the recommended treatment for secondary traumatic stress is really the same as it is for primary traumatic stress. Creating a safe space for teachers to be able to share their stories, to talk to one another, to try and break down some of those walls of isolation, pull back the curtain of what we're doing, and come back together as teachers and colleagues to be able to share our experiences with other people that we know get it. Developing systems and plans for stress management, engaging in counseling services and training programs about secondary traumatic stress. I find that knowledge truly is power. When I'm feeling overwhelmed by something, what I hope is a healthy coping strategy is I want to know everything about it, because that makes me feel more in control and more empowered. Faculty appreciation events, engaging in stress relieving social activities, and spending time with friends and families, doing our hobbies, practicing mindfulness, and prioritizing what has turned into a very big buzzword, which is self-care. And we have to do all of that while also trying to avoid that element of toxic positivity. That if we just don't talk about how hard it is, then maybe all of that will go away. And so, in my opinion, step one is to acknowledge how challenging these past couple of years have been. Not trying to put a positive spin on it, but also not dwelling on the negative. And I like to turn to this research by Dr. Sylvan S. Tompkins on the 9 affects. So he says that there are these 4 positive affects: enjoyment and joy, interest and excitement. And we have these negative affects: shame, humiliation, distress, anguish, disgust, fear and terror, anger and rage. And I love this last one, dismell, which he describes as like that emotion when you sort of turn your nose up at something in disapproval. But he also says that there are these neutral affects, and they're considered neutral because we only live in them for a split second, and then we go to either a positive or a negative affect. And that's surprise or startle. We can't stay surprised for longer than probably 1 Mississippi at most. But what he theorizes is that the more we can maximize those positive affects and minimize the negative, while also feeling free to express all of them without the fear of judgment or retribution, that is when we feel at our best. And I think that's important as teachers, that we have to make sure that we're making space for ourselves and our colleagues to hopefully feel those positive feelings the majority of the time, but also be able to talk about our disappointment, our stress, our anguish, and our anger in light of all of these experiences without the feeling of judgment or retribution. And so what can we do? The role of schools and teachers in being trauma responsive. And I think it comes back to this idea that in every encounter, we either give life or we drain it. There's no such thing as a neutral exchange. And we can anchor ourselves in the 5 principles of trauma-informed care, those being safety. How do we ensure the physical and emotional safety of those that we are in charge of, whether it's students or staff members? Choice. How do we provide individual choice and control? Collaboration. How do we share the responsibilities amongst our staff and amongst the members of our classroom community? Trustworthiness through task clarity, consistency, and setting interpersonal boundaries. And empowerment. How do we prioritize empowerment and skill building? When a student in our care makes a misstep and we give a redirect, are we building that skill for our students, or are we falling back on shame and blame? And when we anchor ourselves in those 5 principles, that's where I think we can truly start to build a positive and intentional wellness plan, recognizing that true wellness is hard work. Self-care is more than a trip to a spa. It's something that we have to do intentionally every single day. We have to dedicate time to it, and we have to work really hard at it. So I'm going to drop another link in the chat. And again, there is also that ability to scan that QR code. This link is going to open you up a document that it will let you make a copy of. And so you just have to click that yes button to make a copy, and that will be one that you can type into. You are welcome to change the color scheme and font to fit your personal preferences. And this is something that we're going to work through together today. The goal is that by the end of the session, we will all have at least 5 commitments to ourselves, where we're setting healthy boundaries and goals that we can strive for as a part of our personal wellness practice, as well as commitments to our students and our school community. And we're going to do it what I hope will be pretty systematically. So the first one that we're going to write, I want us to focus on defining relationships. How will we be intentional about building and maintaining strong relationships? Because we know that the biggest way to counteract stress and trauma and those feelings of isolation is through connection. And so first we have to sort of define relationships. As educators, we've probably all heard the saying, we have to Maslow before we can bloom. We have to achieve those hierarchy of needs that Maslow outlines before we can dive into Bloom's taxonomy of deep critical thinking and learning. And so Maslow's hierarchy says that we first have to meet our physiological needs, having food and shelter, then provide safety, a space where students and ourselves can let our guard down and feel safe, a sense of love and belonging. And I like to highlight that belonging is different from inclusion. Inclusion is you're a name on my roster. Belonging is I have labeled a desk with your name on it. I am intentional about planning for you to be in this space and you truly belong here in this classroom or in this school community. Esteem, the feeling that we can do it, we can achieve. And then self-actualization, that's where we're able to infuse our own identities, grow as learners and communicators. So step 1, we're going to fill in, how are we going to intentionally commit to our relationships? And so I want you to think about that and think about what will your commitment be to yourself to commit to your relationships outside of school? And what will be your commitment to your students and your school community in terms of relationships? And I'm going to give a few ideas and examples, but I want you to know that these are examples. These are not limitations. All right. So for example, I will put my phone and computer down when I'm home with the people that I love. I will go on a walk every day with my spouse or my partner to talk about the day. I will take a day off at least once a quarter to spend a day together with someone I care about. And I'll tell you, I was talking through this presentation with my husband and I got to this one and he said, when do you take a day off? And I had to check him and remind him that I was not asking for his feedback. I was practicing. And so I need to definitely take my own advice in that respect. But those are some examples of how you might commit to yourself and to your family. And I think the highlight here is that idea of selective vulnerability. That's when we choose pieces of ourselves to share with our students and our colleagues. These are stories from our childhood, our successes, our failures. And through that, we're able to humanize ourselves and form strong relationships. And so that's the foundation of building a culture of comfort and taking risks in the classroom. How can we push ourselves beyond, talking about the crazy weather that we're having this December and into talking about the pieces of ourselves that make us who we are, and how that can forge those strong relationships, sharing not only our successes in the classroom, but also our failures and what we learn from them with one another. It can also look like using affective statements when we're interacting with students or even with colleagues that we have a fracture with. And so that looks like explaining the impact and scope of harm resulting from the behavior and humanizing ourselves and our own feelings, focusing on the behavior, not the individual, using a respectful tone. When this happens, here's how it makes me feel. When you talk while I'm talking in our PLC meeting, it makes me feel like you don't value what I have to say, and that really hurts me. And so being an advocate for ourselves, talking to our students, when you say hurtful things to your classmate, that makes me feel sad. And so how can we shift our language and make sure that we're practicing kindness with the people who we are around? And so that could be a goal, is to use more affective statements instead of, hey, I need you to pick your head up and pay attention, trying, are you feeling okay? And so having those positive intentions when we interact with someone who might be struggling just as much as we are. Another great strategy when you're thinking about what you might put in that second column, what do you commit to your students in your school community, is a strategy I love called 2 by 10. I learned about this a few years ago in reading a book called Fostering Resilient Learners. This strategy asks that you choose a student, maybe a student that you're struggling with, and talk to them for 2 minutes every day for 10 days in a row, just 2 minutes. And this strategy encourages that you spend those 2 minutes talking about something outside of academics, outside of school, just getting to know that student and building a stronger connection with them. And then you repeat it every 2 weeks with a new student. And I think that's attainable, taking 2 minutes, 120 seconds to connect with a student and using that as an opportunity to build a strong relationship. So take a second to finalize those 2 commitments for that first one focused on relationships. And as you finalize that, I'm going to talk about step 2. So that next I will statement is going to focus on routine. What routines do we need to have in place in order to protect our time and calm our minds? So this might look like stopping checking emails after 4 p.m. each day, setting sort of a hard stop line for yourself. Now, for some of us, that is awesome. And for others, this might be terrifying. And so that's why you want to make sure this is personal to you. I know colleagues who are like, oh my gosh, if I come in Monday morning and I have 87 emails from the weekend, that stresses me out. I need to look at things the night before and get ahead of it. And so do what makes sense for you and is what's going to promote your own wellness. Exercising every Monday and Wednesday evening for at least 30 minutes, setting a timer on Sunday mornings, and only grading papers for 60 minutes. Those are some examples of things you might put here in terms of setting routines for yourself. And we know that routines are great and they help our students as well. That predictability provides some comfort and sense of safety. And so for your students, you might commit to establishing a routine and maintaining clear communication. Perhaps that's through having morning meetings at the start of the school day with your class, or doing something like this. This comes from one of my ninth grade English teaching colleagues. His opening slide for his students every single day starts with a warm-up, so they always know how class is going to begin. He puts the learning objectives down along the bottom, and he's got, I refer to it as his secret sauce, this box with success looks like, so that he makes sure he's always communicating to his students exactly what the expectations are. He's not asking them to be mind readers. And the thing I love about this is this slide's from October. So this is not something that he does just the first 2 weeks of school. This is something he really does throughout. And that leads to peace of mind for him as a teacher, and also some of that comfort and predictability for his students as well. The next one, step 3, that third row of I will statements, we're going to focus on empowerment. What will you do to empower yourself as a person and as a professional? And this could look like things like, I will practice positive self-talk and intentionally disrupt negative thoughts about myself. And ooh, this one is hard, right? You know, we have those days where we print the wrong copies and we show up to class and we feel like, oh my gosh, how did I manage to do this? I've had those moments where I called a student by the wrong name on the 100th day of school, and I lose sleep over it for weeks. And the way that I talk to myself about myself in my own head is terrible. And so that's something I'm working on, is how to intentionally disrupt those negative thoughts that I have about myself. Maybe it looks like writing a list of 5 things that you did well at the end of each day, even if they're small. using an app like the Calm app or the Down Dog app to practice meditation for 5 minutes each morning as a way to reset and to calm our brains. And for students, we can teach empowerment to them as well. And that might be a commitment that we make in that right-hand column. Those small instructional decisions like giving sentence starters can empower our students as learners so that they can share their thinking out loud. This is especially helpful, I think, for our students who are introverts, our students who are English language learners, because they maybe don't have the academic vocabulary, but they definitely have the critical thinking. And so it's just giving them that opportunity to be able to share. And so having things like, you're going to turn to your elbow partner and you're going to talk about, how do you think this character feels at this part of the story? And when you respond, here's what you're going to say. You're going to say, my name is blank, and I know the character feels this way because in the text it says. And so providing that empowering vocabulary to our students. We also want to instill a sense of safety in our students, because the more that they're able to stay in their learning brain, the calmer it's going to be in our classrooms and the better off we're going to be as teachers. Many students fear that they're at risk of being humiliated in front of their peers. I, as a struggling math student, if I got called on in front of everyone, I always felt like the teacher is trying to make me look dumb in front of my classmates. And so what are the micro moves that we can do as instructors to help our students feel safe, taking those healthy risks that lead to learning? And so this can be doing things like making strategies of cold calling more emotionally safe for our students, saying, you know, this next question is one of my favorites. Brandon, you're going to answer it. I'm going to tell the question, and then I'm going to talk about it for a second, and then I'm going to come back to you and you're going to answer. So it's not just a spur of the moment. You know, having students turn and talk to a partner first and saying up front, you're going to have 30 seconds to share with a partner. Then I'm going to call on some people at random. You can share your answer or your partner's answer. And so you're not playing that game of gotcha with students, and they're going to feel prepared to answer. And hey, even if I'm wrong, my partner agreed with me. So it wasn't just me who thought that was the right answer. And that's really empowering as well. Our next step is to focus on gratitude. We know that when we show gratitude to others, we get that warm, fuzzy feeling in our stomach as well. And so this is a great act of not only self-care, but care for others and supporting our colleagues. So what will you do intentionally to practice gratitude? This could look like, I will give people their flowers while they're here by telling my family and colleagues how thankful I am for them. Making 3 positive phone calls home each week. Nominating a colleague for a teaching award each semester. Looking at those and seeing who is someone that I can shine a light on who's doing awesome work. And then creating islands of competence. I listened to a podcast years ago that I daily kick myself that I can't remember exactly what episode it was, or even what podcast it was, but they talked about an interview with Coach Mike Krzyzewski. If you are a fan of college basketball, you will recognize him as the legendary coach of Duke basketball. And he has won more games than most people in the history of college sports. And in an interview, someone asked him, they said, Coach K, how do you keep your team at such a high level so consistently? And his answer was, well, I can never let them lose more than twice in a row. Because if you lose more than twice in a row, you really start to feel like a loser. And I thought about how that relates to teaching, how when our students are consistently feeling like they can't achieve something, you know, they're in a content area that they struggle with and they feel like they're never able to get the right answer. How can we create small islands of competence for our students to feel like they get it, like they can achieve it and do it? And Coach K talked about, like, sure, we lose games multiple times in a row, but I got to find moments to celebrate, a really good pass, a really good example of defense, so that I can create small wins for the players. And how do we create small wins for our students? How do we create small wins for our teachers? and our teaching colleagues. And we can do that by praising one another and modeling praise and gratitude for the people around us, including the kids in our classrooms. One way to do that is by building it into our instruction. Turn to your partners and congratulate them on a job well done today by giving them a high five, a fist bump, shaking hands, etc. I like to have my ninth graders, 14 and 15 years old, turn to each other and repeat after me. Look at your partner and say, "Thank you for helping me learn today. You are so insightful." And of course, at first they say it, a little cheeky, but by the end of it, I tell you what, they say it with a little bass in their voice because they mean it. They start taking it really seriously and being really intentional about it. And that just builds that stronger classroom community. And the same thing is true for adults. When we show gratitude to the people around us, when other people show gratitude towards us, it gives us that boost that we might need that particular day. Another small strategy, and this is something that we did in my undergraduate courses at UGA, we all made what were called rainy day folders, a physical file that we can put nice notes and cards and letters, not just from students, but from colleagues and from parents when we get those nice emails that come every so often, into that folder, so that on those days when we are not feeling like a 5-star teacher, we can pull that folder out and remind ourselves that we are great at our job and we are here for a reason and we are making an impact and making a difference. Now, the occupational hazard of this strategy is that often I'm crying more after I use it than I was before, as I remember all of those students that I've had the privilege to get to know and to teach. And then that last one, what can you do to grow with purpose? Some examples of that, reading at least one book a month for fun. That's a great personal growth area that you can commit to yourself. Doing 10 minutes of self-curated professional learning each day, whether that's I'm going to read an article about engagement strategies because that's what I need to work on, or I'm going to find a video on the teaching channel or on YouTube that shows something in action, for example. 10 minutes a day, or maybe it's just 20 minutes a week of that self-curated professional learning as a commitment to your school or school community. I will try something new once a week, a new hobby, a new food, a new teaching strategy, listening to new music. Oh, thank you, Ben, for your nice compliment. Yeah, attending an awesome PLC with the Bar Center. And we can do that for our students as well, as we ensure that all of our students see themselves reflected in the curriculum. I love this theory of curriculum as both a window and a mirror. This idea that we want our students to be able to, through the learning in our class, see the way that other people experience the world, like they're looking out a window, but that they can also see themselves reflected in it the same way you see it in this image. And so working to build in those opportunities for students to share from their own lives and their own backgrounds, elevating their voices and perspectives by engaging them in things like problem solving, when challenges arrive in the classroom, being receptive to their input and finding those mutually beneficial solutions, and through praising students for their effort and their hard work. Sure, maybe they're not experiencing the same level of achievement as students did in years past who didn't experience these disruptions in their education as a result of COVID, but they worked really hard on that essay, and wow, look at how much your writing has grown over the past semester, or what a great strategy for studying. You must have worked really hard on this. You've improved so much. So that we instill that growth mindset in our students as well. And I want to give a quick reminder that the existence of trauma doesn't mean that we don't hold our students to high standards. In fact, it means that we should reinforce that high expectation, because that's how we communicate our care for our students, is that we continue to push them to strive and to excel. And so where do we go from here? Hopefully we've all got at least 5 things now written on our working agreements and our wellness creed, both commitments to ourselves and our families and commitments to our students and our school community. And so the next step is probably the hardest one. I encourage you to print this out, to tack it up next to your desk, to set it as your background on your computer, somewhere where you'll see it all the time, and constantly be referring back to it, editing, adding to it to make it something that will fit your personal needs, and help you to stay committed to those agreements and commitments that you've made. And I like to sort of start to round us out by talking about the 5 stages of grief. When school was canceled, I'm sure that there were things that in some ways, maybe we were a little like okay with letting go of. I know for myself, when Q4 got canceled, I thought, man, that research project was not going well. So like now we can just maybe pretend that never happened and I'll do it better next time. But there were also a lot of things that I continue to struggle with. The loss of time with a group of students that I was really connecting with, the changes in how we do school, the added work to our plate, things like that. And what's interesting is that in learning about the 5 stages of grief, I actually learned that they came back and they wrote another book where they identified a 6th stage of grief. And they said number 6 is finding meaning. And so I hope that that's what we're looking towards as we continue on this journey. What do we hope or believe will be the meaning that we find through this experience? And my hope is that at least one level of that meaning will be in anchoring ourselves in that self-care and wellness in a really actionable way. And I want to again recognize what hard work that is. And so that brings me to a very fun metaphor that I learned a while ago, growing up in the land of very tall pine trees. In Georgia, there is a history of growing pine trees for harvest. And there's a saying that says the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, but the second best time to plant a tree is today. And so even if this isn't something that you've been committed to and working towards in years, this is something that we can start today to hopefully make a difference for ourselves and our students. And so a little bit of homework, your homework, and I know many of us are getting ready to go out on winter break, is to write a personal note or an email to a colleague, letting them know that you see the hard work they put in and reassuring them that they are seen, valued, and that their effort is making a difference. So that's your homework. And now I want us to do a quick closing. This is one of my favorite closings. Feel free to steal these sentence starters. I absolutely stole them from a teaching colleague down in Texas. So choose one of these 3 options and you're going to type this in the chat and we will all submit at the same time. So option 1 is I used to think, but now I think. Option 2, what I really need is, or option 3, tomorrow I will. Go ahead and choose your sentence starter and fill in that sentence frame, and we are all going to submit in about 10 seconds. I used to think, but now I think. What I really need is, tomorrow I will. Finish up that thought and then go ahead and have your finger on that enter key, and we're all going to press enter in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. All right, I encourage you to take a second to read through those reflections from other participants in the room. And I want to thank you so much for being here to learn together and hopefully come up with an intentional plan for moving forward in this chaotic world. If you'd like to follow up with me, you can find me on Twitter at Sydney C. Jensen. My email address is up there as well, and my website. Again, thank you so much for showing up today and coming together. And I will turn it back over to Janice. I think we've maybe got a little Q&A time remaining.
Thank you so much, Sydney. That was so inspirational and so wonderful. We do have a few minutes here for questions. If anyone has some questions for Sydney, I do also encourage you to watch her TED Talk that you can find just by searching it out. It looks like Noam has a question.
Yeah, just what do you do when you witness like someone like like a student who's traumatized, like rather than a colleague de-escalating, escalating, like what are your, because I mean my colleague probably is also traumatized, so like I don't know, I just wanted to know, how do you suggest having those conversations with colleagues who are not de-escalating?
That's a great question. It reminds me of the saying that a dysregulated person cannot regulate another dysregulated person. And so if one person is experiencing high emotions, they need to be met with someone who is calm in order to help de-escalate that situation. And it's definitely a challenge when we observe teaching colleagues engaging in that. And so I would say that the first step is to really approach it with presuming positive intentions and offering to help. Like you see that happening in the hallway, coming up and saying, hey, do you want me to maybe walk with the student for a second so that you can have a minute to gather your thoughts and identify next steps? We'll just take a quick walk up and down the hallway, and then I'll come back and I'm happy to help with this. And sort of step in and offer your services as a mediator. I would guess that in that situation, if you approach it that way, that will sort of, be kind of a wake up call to that colleague, like, oh, I definitely maybe was saying some things in a hurtful way or saying things in a tone that wasn't helping the situation. And in retrospect, they're going to come back and say, oh my gosh, Noam, thank you so much for stepping in and being willing to help. And so I think it's approaching it in that mindset of being a helper, not I'm wagging my finger at you sort of mentality. But it's definitely hard to give that feedback to colleagues. It's a lot easier to coach up students from our positions as teachers rather than as colleagues. So,
great question. Any other questions? We have time for a couple more. While you're thinking of questions, I would love for you to write your favorite strategy or your favorite thing that you heard from Sydney today in the chat box. Ari always does a beautiful write-up for our website. And so I would just love to hear what you're taking away from this with you today. So if you want to throw that in the chat while we're just waiting to see if there's any more questions. Looks like lots of great things that people are taking away today. Thank you again so much, Sydney. We are so thrilled that you were able to join us today. I know I'm personally taking a lot of things with me. A lot of people have already started printing. Looks like we're gonna have some rainy day folders. I have a rainy day folder right next to my computer too. So I really appreciated that one. They're still coming. I'm gonna wait a minute so we can all read them. I don't wanna miss any. Yeah, great stuff. And remember, we've talked about before on these PLCs, just trying to be 1% better, right? You don't have to do all of these things, just 1% better. Pick one thing and just try it. And so thank you so much, Sydney. We hope that we'll get to see you again in the future. And thanks for being here with us today.
I hope so too. And thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great winter break, and we will see you in January.